Hello, and welcome back, dear listeners. Tonight, we travel to England, to the grey stone and quiet cloisters of Canterbury, where a cathedral has stood watch over the town for 800 years. It is the winter of 1953. The bells of that great church have rung every dawn and every dusk for longer than anyone living can remember, until one December night, the great bell tolls once, alone, at midnight, when no hand should have touched the rope. By morning, a priest lies dead within the cathedral walls, and the town of Canterbury finds itself holding its breath. Called in by an old friend, Hercule Poirot arrives expecting a quiet visit among the faithful. Instead, he finds a murder wrapped in incense and shadow, a crime hidden behind stained glass and old loyalties, where every confession may conceal a lie, and every hymn may hide a motive. So settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let us step through the cathedral doors together. This is the Silent Bell of Canterbury. The invitation to Canterbury. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Hercule Poirot always felt was an unremarkable day for anything of consequence to happen. Tuesdays, in his experience, belonged to the dull business of replying to tradesmen and enduring the mild tyranny of his own digestion. And yet it was on such a Tuesday, in the last damp week of November, that George brought in the Morning Post upon a small silver tray, and among the bills and the circulars lay an envelope of thick cream paper, addressed in a hand Poirot had not seen in some 15 years. "Canterbury," he murmured, turning the envelope over, as though it might tell him something before he had even opened it. The postmark confirmed what the handwriting had already suggested. He slit it neatly with the little ivory knife he kept for such purposes, and drew out 2 sheets of paper, closely written. "My dear Poirot, you will forgive an old man for troubling you after so long a silence between us, but I find myself in need of a mind such as yours, precise, orderly, and, if I may say so, refreshingly untroubled by sentiment, where sentiment has no business being. I am now, as you may or may not know, the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral. It is a position I have held for the better part of 6 years, and one which I had believed, until recently, to be a peaceful one. I write to you now because something troubles me, and I confess I do not know whether it is the trouble of an old man's nerves or the trouble of something genuinely amiss. 3 nights ago, the great bell of our cathedral, a bell which has not been rung outside its appointed hours in living memory, and which requires, I am assured, considerable strength and no small skill to sound, tolled once, alone, at the stroke of midnight. I was in my study at the time and heard it distinctly. When I made inquiry the following morning, I was told that no one had rung it. The bell-ringer swears he was in his bed. The verger swears the tower was locked, as it always is at that hour, and that the key had not left its hook. I do not like mysteries, Poirot, particularly not mysteries which occur within the walls of a cathedral. I would take it as a great kindness if you would come and spend a few days with me, ostensibly as my guest, and quietly satisfy yourself, and me, that there is some perfectly ordinary explanation for the matter. I fear I am becoming fanciful in my old age, and there is nothing I should like better than for you to tell me so. Your friend, Henry Ainsworth Poirot, read the letter twice, and then a third time, folding it at last with the particular care he gave to documents he suspected he would need again. Henry Ainsworth. They had met in Brussels many years before the war that had ended all wars, only to be followed by another. Ainsworth, then a young clergyman with a taste for continental theology and an alarming habit of losing his hat. Poirot, then a police officer with rather less grey in his moustache than he possessed now. They had solved between them a small matter of a forged reliquary, and had corresponded, with decreasing frequency, ever since. Poirot set the letter down upon the table, and regarded it with his head very slightly to one side, in the manner of a bird considering a piece of bread that might or might not be good to eat. A bell that rang itself. It was, on its face, absurd, the sort of thing that belonged in a ghost story told to children at Christmas, not in the correspondence of a sensible English clergyman. And yet Ainsworth was not a fanciful man. Poirot remembered him as being, if anything, excessively literal, the sort of man who footnoted his own sermons. If Ainsworth said the bell had rung, then the bell had rung, and Poirot did not for one moment believe that bells rang themselves. He rang for George. "George, we are going to Canterbury." "Very good, sir. For how long?" Poirot considered this with the gravity the question deserved. "I do not know, George. That is rather the point of going." The train from Victoria was neither fast nor comfortable, and Poirot spent a good portion of the journey with his coat collar turned up against a draught that seemed to originate from several directions at once, reflecting, not for the first time, that the English had elevated discomfort to something very near a national philosophy. Through the streaked window, the countryside unrolled itself in shades of wet brown and grey, the hop gardens of Kent stripped bare for winter, the occasional oast house standing like a rounded sentinel against the low sky. He had brought with him very little luggage, and rather more curiosity than he cared to admit even to himself. A bell that rang alone at midnight was, after all, precisely the sort of small, irrational fact that experience had taught him not to dismiss. It was Poirot's firm conviction, one he had expressed to several inspectors of several nationalities, generally to their visible irritation, that the little things, the things that did not fit, were invariably more important than the large and obvious things. A dead body announced itself. A bell that rang when no one rang it merely whispered, and it took a particular kind of ear to hear the whisper for what it was. He arrived at Canterbury West as the afternoon was already beginning to surrender to an early winter dusk, the sky the colour of a bruise, and was met on the platform by Ainsworth himself, thinner than Poirot remembered, and stooped in a way that spoke of more than simply the passage of years, though his handshake was as firm as ever. "Poirot, you came." "But of course I came, mon ami. You do not write to me of self-ringing bells and expect that I will stay in London eating my breakfast as though nothing has happened." Ainsworth managed something that was almost a laugh, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "I rather hoped you'd think me a foolish old man and tell me to take a tonic." "I may yet tell you that," said Poirot, "once I have seen the bell. But I do not think so." They walked together from the station, Ainsworth insisting the distance was not worth a taxi despite the cold, and as they went he spoke of the cathedral, of the small community that lived and worked within its precincts, of the choir and the vergers and the canons who came and went about their sacred business like figures in some slow and ancient clockwork. He spoke, too, though more hesitantly, of a certain Canon Whitfield, a man Ainsworth described, after some visible searching for the correct word, as difficult. And here Poirot's small dark eyes sharpened with interest, though he said nothing, for it was, he had long ago decided, always better to let a man arrive at his own confidences in his own time. The cathedral came into view as they rounded a corner of the old town, its great tower rising pale and enormous against the darkening sky, and Poirot, despite himself, stopped for a moment to look up at it, at the vastness of it, the sheer stubborn permanence of stone that had stood through so many centuries of English weather and English sin. Somewhere above them, silent now, hung the bell. "Tell me, Ainsworth," Poirot said quietly, "who besides yourself heard it ring?" The bell that should not ring. Ainsworth did not answer at once. He drew his coat more closely about himself, and for a moment Poirot thought the old man had not heard the question, or had chosen, in the manner of Englishmen when confronted with something inconvenient, to pretend he had not. "Two others," he said at last, "Canon Whitfield, whose lodgings are nearest the tower, and young Simmons, our bell-ringer, though Simmons swears most vigorously that he heard it only because it woke him, and that he was in his bed the whole while, which his wife confirms." "And Canon Whitfield, what does he say of it?" "That it woke him also, and that he looked from his window and saw nothing, no light, no figure, nothing at all, which is, I confess, rather worse than if he had seen something. A prowler one can understand. An empty tower ringing itself in the dark is another matter entirely. They had reached the great west door by now, and Ainsworth led him through into the precincts, that hushed, enclosed world within the cathedral walls where the noise of the town seemed to fall away as though a curtain had been drawn across it. Poirot found himself walking more slowly than was his habit, taking in the details with the particular attention he gave to any new terrain in which a mystery had chosen to plant itself. The worn stone underfoot, smoothed by some 7 centuries of pilgrim feet, the long shadows thrown by the last of the daylight through windows of glass, so old and so dark with age that the saints depicted in them seemed to watch the two men pass with expressions of patient, ancient reproach. "You will meet the household at dinner," Ainsworth said. "I have not told them the true reason for your visit. As far as they are concerned, you are an old friend come to see the cathedral before Advent begins in earnest." "That is wise," said Poirot, "for the present at least. A man who knows he is suspected of nothing will say a great many things he would not otherwise say." Dinner was taken in the deanery, a long, low-ceilinged room hung with portraits of deans long dead, their painted eyes following the small gathering with the same faint reproach Poirot had noted in the cathedral windows. The company was smaller than he had expected. Canon Whitfield, a large, florid man with a voice pitched for addressing congregations rather than dinner tables. Mr. Simmons the bell-ringer, thin and nervous, who ate very little and said less. And a Miss Prentice, the dean's niece, who kept house for her uncle and who watched the proceedings with a quiet, contained attention that Poirot found rather more interesting than anything said aloud. It was Canon Whitfield who first mentioned the bell, and he did so, Poirot noted, with a heartiness that seemed designed to close the subject rather than open it. "You'll have heard, I don't doubt, of our little mystery," he said, addressing Poirot with the joviality of a man discussing a minor inconvenience. "A leaking gutter, perhaps, or a stray dog. Some trick of the wind in the tower, I shouldn't wonder. Old buildings creak and groan. It would be stranger still if they did not." "The wind," said Poirot politely, "rang the bell. Stranger things have happened." "Have they? I have not myself encountered one, but I am always happy to learn." Something flickered behind Whitfield's eyes. Irritation, perhaps, or something closer to unease, and he turned the conversation, with the practiced smoothness of a man used to steering discussions from the pulpit, to the subject of the weather, and thence to the deplorable state of the roads leading into the town. Poirot allowed himself to be led, watching all the while, and noted that Miss Prentice, though she said nothing, had not once taken her eyes from her plate during the exchange. It was Simmons who interested him more, in the end. Simmons who pushed his food about without eating it, and who started visibly when a log shifted in the fireplace with a soft collapse of ash. "You are the bell-ringer, Monsieur Simmons," Poirot said, turning to him with the gentle, almost conversational manner he reserved for witnesses he judged to be frightened rather than guilty, though he had learned, over many years, that the two were not always so easily told apart. It must require, I think, considerable skill. 10 years I've rung that bell, sir, man and boy. Well, not boy. I came to it as a man, but you understand my meaning. 10 years, and never once has it sounded when it oughtn't, not till 3 nights past. And you were certain, when you heard it, that it was the great bell, and not some other. There's no mistaking it, sir. Not once you've heard it proper. It's got a voice all its own. Simmons's hand, Poirot noticed, trembled very slightly as he lifted his glass. "I'll tell you straight, sir. I don't like it. A bell doesn't ring itself. Something rang it. And in a cathedral, at midnight, with no living soul near it, well, a man starts thinking of things he's not thought of since he was a child, listening to his grandmother's stories. You think," said Poirot carefully, "that it was not a living soul that rang it." Simmons did not answer directly, but the look he gave Poirot across the table was answer enough, and after that he said very little more for the remainder of the meal. After dinner, Ainsworth took Poirot up into the tower himself, candle in hand, the two of them climbing a narrow spiral stair, worn into smooth hollows by centuries of feet, the cold growing sharper with every turn, until Poirot could see his own breath in the candlelight. The bell chamber, when they reached it, was a bare stone room dominated entirely by the great bell itself, hanging silent and enormous in the dark, its bronze surface catching what little light there was and throwing it back in dull, uneven gleams. Poirot walked slowly around it, his candle held high, examining the mechanism by which it was rung. A stout rope descending through a hole in the floor to the ringing chamber below, a wheel, a headstock, with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who did not yet know what he was looking for, but who trusted that he would recognize it when he found it. "The door to this tower," he said at last. "It was locked, you say, on the night in question. Locked, and the key on its hook in the vestry, where it has hung for as long as I have been dean. Only 3 people hold keys of their own, myself, the verger, and Simmons, in his capacity as ringer. And on the night the bell rang, all 3 keys were accounted for. All 3. I checked myself the following morning, before I had properly considered why I was doing so." Poirot said nothing for a long moment, running one gloved finger along the cold curve of the bell's rim, where a faint, irregular mark caught the candlelight. A scuff, perhaps, or a scratch, of a kind that might have been made by rope or by something else entirely. He bent closer, studying it, and then straightened again, his expression giving away nothing at all. "Mon ami," he said at last, "I think your bell has told me something already, though I do not yet know what it is that it has told me. But I will say this: a locked door and 3 accounted keys are the sort of facts a clever person arranges very carefully indeed, and one does not arrange such things over a matter of wind in the rafters." Ainsworth's candle trembled slightly in his hand. "Then you believe it was deliberate?" "I believe," said Poirot, looking up at the great silent shape above them, "that somebody wished this bell to be heard, and I think, my friend, that we would both do well to ask ourselves why a person commits such trouble, such risk, merely to make a sound in the dark, and what that same person intended should follow after it." Neither of them spoke as they descended the stair, and neither, though each perhaps suspected the other's thought, gave voice to the question that hung between them: what, if anything, had followed? "The priest is found." Poirot woke, as was his habit, a little before 7, and lay for some minutes in the unfamiliar comfort of the deanery's best guest-room, listening to the particular silence of the cathedral precincts, a silence broken only by the distant, ordinary sounds of a household beginning its day, a door somewhere below, the clink of crockery, a voice raised briefly and then hushed. It was, he reflected, a silence quite unlike the silence of the bell tower the night before, which had seemed to him a listening sort of silence, watchful and expectant. This was merely peaceful. The peace did not last beyond his descent to breakfast. He had scarcely seated himself at the table and had not yet so much as unfolded his napkin when the door of the breakfast-room was thrown open without ceremony, and a young man in the plain black of a verger's assistant stood upon the threshold, his face the colour of the porridge growing cold in the dish before Poirot, and quite unable, for several seconds, to produce any words at all. "Well, Tomkins?" Ainsworth had risen halfway from his chair. "What is it, man? Speak." "It's Canon Whitfield, sir." The young man's voice cracked upon the name. Sir, he's dead, in the Lady Chapel. I found him not 10 minutes since, when I went to see to the candles, and Sir, it isn't natural, the way he's lying, and there's—" He stopped, swallowed, and finished, in a smaller voice than before. "There's blood, sir. On the flagstones. I've sent Davies for the police." Poirot was on his feet before the sentence had ended, his napkin still in his hand, all thought of breakfast gone from him as completely as though it had never existed. He was aware, in the periphery of his attention, of Miss Prentice appearing in the doorway behind the young man, her face very white, one hand pressed to the frame as though she required it to remain standing. He noted it, filed it away, and gave it no further thought for the moment, for there were more pressing matters at hand. "Ainsworth, take me to him. Now, if you please, and let no one else enter the chapel before we have seen it as it is." They went together, Poirot's short legs working hard to match the Dean's longer hurrying stride through the cloister and into the great hush of the cathedral itself, where the early light fell in long grey shafts through windows still dim with the last of the morning mist. The Lady Chapel lay in a side aisle, a small enclosed space of extraordinary quiet, even by the standards of the building that contained it. And it was there, upon the worn stone before the altar rail, that Canon Whitfield lay. He lay upon his back, one arm flung out from his body as though he had reached, in his last moment, for something just beyond his finger's grasp, and his large, florid face, so full of jovial colour the night before, was now the grey-white of the stone beneath him. There was blood, not a great quantity, but enough, spreading in a dark stain from beneath his head, where it had come to rest against the stone step of the altar. Poirot knelt beside the body with the swift, economical movements of a man who had performed this particular examination a great many times before, and who had long ago learned to set aside whatever private feeling the sight of death provoked in him, that he might attend properly to what death had left behind. "A blow," he said quietly, half to Ainsworth and half to himself, "to the back of the head. A single blow, I think, and a heavy one." His eyes moved from the wound to the floor around it, to the altar rail, to the great brass candlestick that stood, he now observed, not quite in its accustomed place upon the altar step, set some inches from where its companion stood, and where, presumably, it too had once stood before being moved. "You keep a pair of these candlesticks, Ainsworth." "Always a pair, always matched, upon this altar, always. It has been so since before my time here. Then we are, for the present, missing one candlestick from a pair, and I think, mon ami, we need not trouble ourselves overmuch as to where it has gone, for I do not think it has gone far, and I think when it is found, it will tell us a great deal." He did not touch it, the remaining candlestick, but studied it from where he knelt, noting its weight, its solid brass base, the sort of object that might, in a desperate hand, become something other than an instrument of worship. He turned his attention back to the body itself, to the dead man's hands, still and heavy at his sides, save the one flung outward, and to the expression frozen upon the grey face, which struck Poirot, the longer he studied it, as bearing not the look of a man taken entirely by surprise, but something closer to the look of a man who had turned, perhaps, at a sound behind him, and had known, in the last fraction of a second available to him, precisely what was about to happen, and precisely why. "He knew," Poirot murmured. "Whoever struck him, I think Canon Whitfield knew them, and did not fear them enough to flee, though perhaps he ought to have." Poirot, Ainsworth's voice, when it came, was unsteady in a way Poirot had not yet heard from him. "Last night, you asked him about the bell. You saw how he answered, that heartiness of his, brushing it aside. Do you think—" "I think a great many things, mon ami, and it is far too early to say which of them are worth the thinking." Poirot rose, brushing the dust of the flagstones from his knees, with a fastidiousness that seemed, in the circumstances, almost absurd, and yet which steadied him, as such small rituals of order always did, against the disorder that lay before him. "But I will say this much. A man does not die by accident in a locked cathedral 3 nights after its great bell rings itself in the dark. These two things are connected, Ainsworth, as surely as this candlestick is connected to that wound, though I do not yet know the manner of the connection, and I would ask you not to guess aloud at it, for a guess spoken too early has a way of becoming a belief, and a belief has a way of blinding a man to whatever does not agree with it." There were footsteps now in the nave beyond, several sets, hurried, and a voice Poirot did not recognize giving low, urgent instructions. And a moment later, a police constable appeared at the chapel's entrance, followed closely by a heavier, older man in plain clothes whose bearing announced him, before he had spoken a word, as the inspector in charge. "Detective Inspector Hargreave," the man said, his eyes moving swiftly from Ainsworth to Poirot to the body upon the floor, missing, Poirot judged, very little in the process. "Dean, and this gentleman, a guest of mine," Ainsworth said. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Something changed, very slightly, in the inspector's heavy face. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness, or some combination of both. "I've heard the name," he said, after a pause that told Poirot a great deal about the sort of man Hargreave was likely to prove. Neither a fool, evidently, nor a man inclined to welcome assistance he had not himself requested. "I'll ask you not to touch anything further, sir, guest of the Dean's or no. This is a police matter now." "But of course, Inspector." Poirot inclined his head with perfect courtesy and stepped back from the body with the easy compliance of a man who had no present intention of being anywhere but precisely where the investigation would eventually lead him. "I would not dream of interfering. I am merely," he added, with the faintest suggestion of a smile beneath his moustache, "a guest, admiring the architecture, and it is a very fine chapel, Inspector, is it not? One notices a great many things, admiring architecture." Hargreave regarded him for a moment with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite amusement, and said nothing further on the subject, turning instead to his constable and to the grim business that now occupied him. But Poirot, withdrawing to the edge of the chapel, with Ainsworth beside him, cast one last glance back at the still figure upon the stone, at the missing candlestick, at the flung-out arm, at the small dark stain already drying at the edges in the cold morning air, and knew, with the particular certainty that came to him at the beginning of every case he had ever undertaken, that he had already begun, whether Inspector Hargreave welcomed it or not, to see the shape of something that lay hidden beneath the surface of what had happened here. Not merely a murder, but the ending of a story that had begun long before the bell rang, and that would not, he suspected, end merely with the removal of poor Canon Whitfield's body from the cold stones of his own Lady Chapel. Questions among the faithful. By mid-morning, the cathedral had taken on the strange, muffled atmosphere that Poirot had observed before at the scene of sudden death. A place of ordinary business abruptly suspended, its usual quiet rhythms replaced by a different, more watchful stillness. The body had been removed, the police surgeon had come and gone, pronouncing what Poirot had already deduced for himself, that the canon had died from a single heavy blow to the back of the skull, delivered, in the surgeon's opinion, by someone standing very close behind him, and very possibly known to him. The missing candlestick had been found within the hour, thrust hastily behind a stack of hassocks in the vestry cupboard, its base darkened with a stain that would want no laboratory to identify. Inspector Hargreave had established himself in the chapter house, a small octagonal room ordinarily used for the business of the cathedral's governance, and had begun, with the methodical thoroughness of a man who distrusted brilliance and trusted procedure, to work his way through the household one by one. Poirot, to his own mild surprise, had been permitted to remain. Hargreave's exact words had been, "You may sit, Monsieur Poirot, and you may listen. And if you've a mind to ask a question when I've finished with mine, I'll not stop you, provided you don't waste my morning," which Poirot had judged, correctly, to be as warm a welcome as the inspector was likely to extend to anyone. Simmons the bell-ringer came first, and gave his account in a voice that shook rather more than it had done at dinner the night before. He had been in his bed, he said again, from 10 o'clock until morning. His wife would confirm it. He had heard nothing, seen nothing, and had certainly not been near the Lady Chapel, which in any case he had no cause to visit, his duties being confined to the Tower. "You didn't care for Canon Whitfield," Hargreave said, not unkindly, but without troubling to soften the observation into a question. Simmons's hands, folded in his lap, tightened upon themselves. "I'll not speak ill of the dead, sir. That's not what I asked you." There was a long pause, and then Simmons said, low, "He was not a kind man, sir, whatever else he was. He had it in for me over a matter of the Bell Fund accounts 2 years back. Said I'd been careless with them, which I never was, and he never let a chance go by to remind me of it before the chapter. But I'll swear on my mother's grave I never laid a hand on him." When Simmons had gone, shown out by the constable with a gentleness that suggested even Hargreave did not much suspect him, Poirot leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Inspector, if I may, This matter of the Bell Fund accounts, was it ever resolved? Hargreave consulted a small notebook. Cleared him entirely, according to the chapter minutes. Whitfield never withdrew the accusation publicly, though, from what I gather. Held a grudge, by the sound of it, on both sides. A small thing, Poirot murmured. But small things, Inspector, are so very often the seeds from which larger things grow. Miss Prentice came next, composed now, though pale, and gave her account with the careful precision of a woman who had rehearsed it. Whether from guilt or merely from nervousness, Poirot could not yet say. She had risen at her usual hour, 6:30, had gone about her ordinary morning duties in the kitchen, and had not gone near the cathedral itself until summoned by Tompkins's shouting. She had not liked Canon Whitfield greatly. Here she hesitated, glancing briefly at her uncle, who sat silent and grey-faced in the corner. But she could think of no one who would wish him dead, and said so with an emphasis that struck Poirot as protesting rather more than the question had required. It was only as she rose to leave that Poirot, almost as an afterthought, asked the question that would later trouble him a good deal more than he expected. "Mademoiselle, the candlestick that was found. You keep the vestry cupboard, I think, in some order. Was it disturbed, would you say, in a manner you would have noticed, had you passed it yesterday evening?" "I couldn't say, Monsieur Poirot. I don't go into the vestry of an evening as a rule." "Ah, a pity." Poirot inclined his head, satisfied, and let her go, and it was not until a good deal later, turning the interview over in his mind, as was his habit before sleep, that he realized, with a small private irritation at himself, that he had failed entirely to ask her whether she had gone into the vestry that morning, before the body was found, which was in fact the more pertinent question, and one to which, he suspected, though he could not yet prove it, the answer might not have been so simple. It was, he told himself afterward, the sort of oversight that came from asking a question already half satisfied with the answer he expected, and he resolved, with the particular annoyance of a man unaccustomed to his own carelessness, not to make the same error twice. Even Hercule Poirot, he admitted to no one but himself, could on occasion ask the right question in the wrong order, and pay for it in time lost. The verger, an elderly, deliberate man named Coates, who had held his position for some 30 years, added little beyond confirming what was already known of the locked tower and the accounted keys, save for one observation that caused Poirot to sit forward with sudden attention. "There's a fourth key, sir," Coates said, in answer to Hargreaves' routine question as to who held access to the tower. Or there was, once. Old Canon Fellows, dead these 10 years now, had one cut for himself, back when he had a fancy for the bells, wanting to learn the ringing in his old age, God rest him. Whether it was ever handed back after his death, I couldn't say for certain. "It's not among the 3 I know of, at any rate." Hargreaves' pencil stopped upon the page. "You're telling me there may be a key to that tower unaccounted for, and you're only mentioning it now. I'd forgotten it entire, sir, until this moment, and that's the truth. It's 10 years and more since Canon Fellows had cause to use it." Poirot said nothing aloud, but he felt, quite distinctly, the small, cold satisfaction of a piece falling into a place he had not previously known existed. A fourth key, unaccounted for, belonging to a dead man, and somewhere, presumably, still in existence, in the hands of whoever had thought to keep it, or had simply never thought to return it at all. It was Ainsworth himself who was questioned last, and it was, Poirot thought, watching his old friend's stricken face across the small room, the most difficult interview of the morning, for reasons that had nothing to do with suspicion. For Hargreave, whatever his private thoughts, conducted the questioning with evident and genuine reluctance, and Ainsworth answered as a man answers who has spent a sleepless night turning over, again and again, the small ordinary unkindnesses and disagreements of years, searching them for the shape of a motive he could neither quite dismiss nor quite believe. "He and I did not always agree," Ainsworth admitted, when Hargreave pressed him gently on the nature of his relationship with the dead man. "He thought me soft in matters of chapter discipline. I thought him—" He stopped, and seemed to consider several words before discarding them all. I thought him a man who had mistaken sternness for virtue somewhere along the way and had never noticed the substitution. But, Inspector, I give you my word, whatever our differences, I did not wish him dead. I would not have wished such an end on any man, let alone one I had broken bread with not 12 hours before it came to him. When the interviews were concluded and Hargreave had withdrawn to confer with his constable, Poirot remained a moment longer in the small octagonal room, turning over in his mind the fragments the morning had yielded. A grudge over accounts, unresolved, a hesitation in a niece's careful account, a fourth key, belonging to a dead man, unaccounted for these 10 years. Threads, all of them, and none yet leading anywhere he could say with certainty, save that somewhere within this quiet, ordered community of faith, someone had moved with sufficient cunning to ring a bell unheard by human hand, and sufficient nerve, 3 nights later, to end a man's life before an altar, and had done so, Poirot was now quite certain, not in a moment of sudden passion, but as the second step of a plan whose first step had been that strange midnight tolling, a warning perhaps, or a rehearsal, or something else again that he had not yet the wit to name. He rose at last, straightened his waistcoat with the small precise gesture that was, for him, almost a form of thought made visible, and went in search of the fourth key's history. For it seemed to him that a key kept 10 years past its need was a key kept for a reason, and reasons, in Poirot's long experience, were rarely so innocent as their keepers liked to believe. The church's old secrets. The cathedral library occupied a long, narrow chamber above the cloister, reached by a stair so worn and so steep that Poirot, climbing it, was obliged to pause twice and reflect, not for the first time on this visit, that the England of the Middle Ages had built a great deal of splendor upon remarkably little consideration for the comfort of elderly detectives. He found there, among the tall glass-fronted cases and the smell of old vellum and beeswax, a Mr. Latimer, the cathedral's honorary archivist, a small stooped man of perhaps 70, with ink-stained fingers and the mild, faraway expression of a man who had long ago concluded that the dead were better company than the living. "Canon Fellows," Latimer repeated, when Poirot had explained the nature of his interest, and something in his manner sharpened at once, the vagueness falling away like a dropped shawl. "Now there is a name I had not thought to hear again. You'll forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, if I ask what concern the police have with a man 10 years in his grave. For the present, only a small one, a matter of a key, no more. But I have found, in a long career of asking questions, that a man who has been dead 10 years can sometimes tell us a great deal about a man who died only yesterday, provided one is willing to listen to what the records have to say of him." Latimer regarded him for a moment with the shrewd, unhurried appraisal of a man who spent his days deciding which documents deserved his trust, and then, apparently satisfied, drew out a low stool and gestured Poirot to a seat beside a table already scattered with the ordinary business of his cataloguing. "Canon Fellows," he said, settling himself, "was precentor here for the better part of 30 years, and by all outward account a most learned and devout man, a scholar of some reputation, particularly in matters concerning the cathedral's own history. It was Fellows who catalogued the greater part of our reliquary collection back before the war, and it was Fellows, I might add, who developed rather late in life an unfortunate fondness for the bells, which I confess struck those of us who knew him as somewhat out of character. He had never, before that, shown the smallest interest in campanology." "When precisely did this fondness begin?" "Some 2 years before his death. I recall it because he came to me himself, quite excited, to consult certain of our older records concerning the tower, the dates of the bells casting, the history of the ringing chamber, that sort of antiquarian detail. I thought it an old man's harmless enthusiasm at the time. I confess I think somewhat differently of it now, though I could not tell you precisely why, save that your questions this morning have set me remembering things I had rather forgotten." Poirot's eyes had not left the archivist's face. "Tell me what it is you remember, monsieur, and let us see together whether it is important." Latimer was silent a moment, his ink-stained fingers turning over a small brass paperweight upon the table before him, and when he spoke again, it was more slowly, as a man picks his way across ground he does not entirely trust. There was, some 30 years past, before my own time here, you understand, but the matter is recorded, if one knows where to look. A scandal concerning a reliquary said to contain a fragment of the true cross, gifted to this cathedral in the 15th century, and displayed, in those days, in a chapel very near to the Lady Chapel where poor Whitfield was found. The relic vanished during a period of restoration work in the tower, the very tower, Monsieur Poirot, whose bell has lately caused you such interest, and was never recovered. The official record states that it was lost, or destroyed, in the confusion of that restoration. There were those at the time, however, who whispered a different account, that it had been sold, quietly, by someone within the chapter itself, to a private collector, and that the loss had been covered over, rather than confessed, for the sake of the cathedral's good name. And Canon Fellows, he had some particular interest in this old scandal. He had every interest, Monsieur Poirot, for it was his own grandfather who had served as precentor at the time of the reliquary's disappearance, and whose name, I regret to say, was among those most closely whispered of in connection with its loss. I believe, though this is my own conjecture, and I would not swear to it before a court, that Fellows spent the last years of his life attempting to discover the truth of the matter, whether to clear his family's name or to satisfy some scholar's private curiosity, I cannot say. His sudden interest in the tower, in its old records, in the bells themselves, I think now it was no mere hobby, but a search. Whether he found what he sought, I could not tell you. He died, as you know, before he had published anything upon the subject, if indeed he ever intended to. Poirot sat very still for a long moment, and Latimer, watching him, seemed to sense that he had said something of rather greater weight than he had understood at the outset. "Monsieur Latimer," Poirot said at last, "you have given me something of great value, though I do not yet know its precise shape. Tell me, is it your understanding that Canon Whitfield had any interest in this same matter, in the lost reliquary, or in Canon Fellows's private researches?" "That I could not say with certainty. But I will tell you this. Whitfield came to me himself, not 3 months past, asking after certain of Fellows's papers, which had been left to the cathedral library upon his death, and which I had, I confess, never troubled to sort with any thoroughness. I gave him what boxes I had, and he took them away to his own rooms, and he did not return them before." Latimer paused, and finished, quietly. "Before his death, Monsieur Poirot. They will be there still, I should think, unless someone has already removed them." Poirot rose from his stool with a suddenness that startled the old archivist. "Then we must go and see, monsieur, before someone thinks to do so ahead of us, for a box of old papers left untouched for a decade, and then sought out by 2 men in turn, each of whom is now beyond questioning, is not, I think, a coincidence I am prepared to leave unexamined even for 1 further hour." They found Whitfield's rooms already under the eye of a young constable stationed at Hargreaves' order, and it required some minutes of courteous but insistent explanation, and, in the end, the fortunate arrival of Hargreave himself, drawn by curiosity to the sound of the discussion, before Poirot was permitted inside. The rooms themselves were spare, and ordered in the manner of a man who valued discipline above comfort, and it was in a cupboard beside the writing desk that they found what Latimer had described: 2 wooden boxes of papers, tied with faded string, both plainly disturbed, one lid ajar, several papers within it out of their original order, as though someone had gone through them in haste or in urgency, searching for some particular document among the rest. "Someone has been here before us," Poirot said quietly, lifting the topmost papers with careful fingers. "And I think, Inspector, whoever it was did not find quite everything they were looking for, or they would not have left the box in such disorder. A thorough search, satisfied, restores what it disturbs. This was not restored. This was abandoned, perhaps in haste, perhaps because the searcher was disturbed at their work. Hargreave, peering over his shoulder with the wary curiosity of a practical man, confronted with matters he had not expected to find relevant to a straightforward case of murder, said, "You're telling me this business goes back 30 years, to some old story about a stolen relic?" "I am telling you, Inspector, that a bell rang in the night to warn someone, or to test something, or perhaps merely to draw someone's eye toward the tower where old secrets had once been searched for. That 3 nights later, a man died before an altar not 200 feet from where that same relic vanished a generation ago. And that the same dead man had, in the months before his death, taken possession of papers belonging to another man who had spent his own last years chasing precisely that vanished relic's shadow. I do not say these things are certainly connected, mon ami, but I have long ago ceased to believe in coincidences so generous as this one would have to be, were it truly no more than chance." He set the papers down at last, his dark eyes moving once more about the spare, orderly room, and added, half to himself, in the tone of a man already reaching forward into a darkness he had not yet fully mapped, "Somewhere in this cathedral, Inspector, there is a secret old enough to have outlived 2 of the men who sought it. I think it is time we discovered whether it has also outlived its patience for being sought." The second warning. It was Miss Prentice herself who came upon it, 2 mornings later, and it was her scream, brief, quickly stifled, but carrying nonetheless through the stone corridors of the deanery, with a clarity that brought Poirot from his room at something rather faster than his usual dignified pace, that announced to the household that the affair of Canterbury Cathedral was not, after all, concluded with the death of one difficult canon. She had gone, as was her habit, to open the shutters of the small morning room that overlooked the cloister garth, and had found, propped against the glass from the outside, a single sheet of paper, upon which was written, in letters cut from what appeared to be the pages of a hymnal and pasted with more haste than skill, a message of some 6 words: "Let the dead rest." Ask no more. By the time Poirot reached the room, Ainsworth was already there, his face grey, and Hargreave had been sent for. Poirot examined the paper without touching it, his head tilted in that manner Ainsworth had by now come to recognize as indicating thought rather than mere curiosity. "A hymnal," he said. "Not a rare object in a cathedral, I think, which tells us very little in itself, save that whoever cut these letters did so within these walls, or very near them, and did not trouble to disguise the source, either from confidence that it would never be traced, or from simple carelessness. Or," said Hargreave, arriving in time to hear the last of this and setting down his hat with the air of a man who had slept very little, because they wanted it known that it came from inside these walls. "A warning's no use, Monsieur Poirot, if the person it's meant for doesn't feel the breath of it on the back of their neck." Poirot inclined his head, conceding the point with evident respect. He had, in the 2 days since the discovery of Whitfield's body, developed a genuine regard for the inspector's slow, careful intelligence, which he had come to recognize as a great deal sharper than its unhurried manner suggested. "You are right to say so, Inspector, and it brings us to the question I think matters more than the paper itself. Who among us has been asking questions loudly enough and persistently enough to earn such a warning?" The answer, when it came, arrived from an unexpected quarter. It was Miss Prentice who, white-faced and still visibly shaken from her discovery, asked to speak with Poirot alone that afternoon. A request that surprised him rather less than it might have done a lesser student of human nature, for he had marked, since the morning of the murder, a certain watchfulness in her manner that had suggested a woman carrying some private weight she had not yet found the occasion, or the courage, to set down. They spoke in the small morning room itself, the pasted warning now removed to Hargreave's keeping, the winter light falling thin and pale through the cloister windows. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, and stopped, her hands twisting together in her lap, in a gesture he recognized from their first interview, and which he now understood, with the small private chagrin of a man correcting an earlier error, he ought to have pressed rather harder upon at the time. I did not tell you the whole truth when you asked me about the vestry. You asked whether I had noticed anything disturbed the evening before Canon Whitfield died. I told you I did not go into the vestry of an evening. That was true. But I did not tell you that I went there that same morning before Tomkins found him, and that I saw the candlestick was missing from its place even then. Poirot sat very still. You saw this before the body was discovered? Yes. I went to fetch fresh linens for the altar, as I do most mornings before the early service, and I noticed at once that one of the pair was gone. I thought nothing of it. I assumed it had been taken for cleaning or moved for some ordinary purpose, and I went about my business and thought no more of it until I heard Tomkins shouting not 20 minutes later. Her voice had dropped very low. I did not say so to you or to the inspector because I was afraid that it would appear I had been in the chapel very near the time he died, and that no one would believe I had seen nothing else, touched nothing else, and simply walked away. And did you? Poirot asked, gently, but without softening the directness of the question. See anything else, mademoiselle? Anyone else, perhaps, near the chapel, or leaving it? She hesitated, and in that hesitation Poirot felt, quite distinctly, the presence of the fact she had truly come to confess, the missing candlestick being merely the door through which she had found the courage to approach it. I saw my uncle, she said at last, very quietly, coming from the direction of the Lady Chapel, perhaps a quarter of an hour before I found the candlestick gone. I did not think of it again until this morning, when I found that dreadful paper, and I thought, if I say nothing, and it comes out some other way, it will look far worse for both of us than if I speak now. Poirot was silent for a long moment, and it was, he reflected afterward, one of the very few moments in the whole affair when he permitted himself to feel something of the weight that lay upon the shoulders of those he questioned. For he did not for one instant believe that Ainsworth, his old friend, had murdered Canon Whitfield, and yet he understood, with the clarity of long experience, that belief and proof were two very different currencies, and that Hargreave would not deal in the former. You have done right to tell me, he said at last, though I think, mademoiselle, you should have told me sooner, and I think also that I should have asked you more carefully at the first, for a question asked in haste, satisfied too easily with its answer, is very often a question asked badly, and I confess that was my own error as much as your omission. We will not repeat it now. Tell me exactly what you saw, the hour, so far as you can judge it, and anything at all of my friend's manner as he came from that direction. It was not yet 7, and he did not seem as a man seems who has just done a dreadful thing, Monsieur Poirot. He seemed troubled, yes, but no more troubled than he had seemed for some days past, since the bell rang. I would swear to that, if it would help him. It may yet do so, Poirot said, though not, perhaps, in the manner you hope, for the truth, mademoiselle, has a way of helping a man only when it is permitted to travel its full distance, and not merely the distance we ourselves have chosen to let it go. He left her there and went in search of Ainsworth, and found him at last in the cathedral itself, standing alone before the high altar in the fading afternoon light, his hands folded before him in an attitude that might have been prayer, or might simply have been the stillness of a man too tired to do anything else. Ainsworth. I must ask you where you were on the morning Whitfield died, a little before 7 o'clock. The Dean did not turn at once. When he did, his face held no surprise, only a weary sort of resignation, as of a man who had been waiting for precisely this question, and had almost begun to wish it would come sooner, that the waiting itself might end. I was in the Lady Chapel, he said. I went to pray there, as I often do before the early office. It is a habit of many years, Poirot, and one I did not think to mention, because it did not occur to me that a man's private devotions could require an alibi. Whitfield was not there when I came, nor when I left some 10 minutes later. I saw no one. I touched nothing. I did not so much as notice whether the candlesticks stood in their proper place. God forgive me, for I had no cause to look for such a thing. And you told none of this to Hargreave. I did not think it mattered. I see now that I was a fool not to think so. Ainsworth's voice cracked, very slightly, on the last words. You believe me, Poirot? I believe, said Poirot slowly, that a man does not warn strangers away from asking questions about a murder he himself committed, mon ami, for such a man has every reason to wish the questions to stop, of their own accord, quietly, and no reason at all to draw fresh attention to the fact that questions are being asked. Whoever pasted those letters to Miss Prentice's window did so because our questions have already come too near something they wish buried. And that, I think, is not the act of a guilty man covering his own crime, but of a frightened one protecting a secret that predates poor Whitfield's death by a very great many years. You are not free of suspicion yet, my friend, but I do not think in my own private judgment that you are the one I am looking for. It was, he reflected as he left the Dean once more alone before his altar, a judgment he intended to keep very much to himself where Hargreave was concerned. For private conviction, however strongly held, was not evidence, and evidence, increasingly, was what this strange and old affair demanded. The mechanism of the bell. It was Simmons, of all people, who gave Poirot the final piece he needed, though he did so without the least understanding that he had given anything at all, and it took the better part of an afternoon's patient conversation, conducted over the ringing chamber's cold stone floor, with the great bell rope hanging motionless between them, before Poirot understood the significance of what he had been told. You said, Monsieur Simmons, when first we spoke, that there is no mistaking the voice of your bell, that a man who has heard it rung properly could not confuse it with any other sound. I wish you to explain to me now, in as much detail as your skill allows, precisely how a bell such as this one is rung, and what strength, and what particular knowledge such ringing requires. Simmons, flattered despite the grimness of the circumstances to be asked to speak of his craft, warmed to the subject with an eagerness that told Poirot he had judged the man correctly, a nervous soul, but an honest one, and one who loved his bells with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who had found, in the discipline of the rope and the wheel, a peace he had perhaps not found elsewhere. It's not so simple as pulling a rope, sir. Whatever folk may think who've never done it, the bell must swing full circle to sound proper, mouth upward to mouth upward, through the whole arc, and that takes both strength and knowledge of the rhythm of it, else you'll find yourself pulled clean off your feet, or the bell striking wrong, or not striking at all. A man untrained could heave on that rope till his arms gave out, and get nothing for his trouble but a dull clonk, if he got even that. And to make it sound but once, a single toll, clear and true, as you heard it that night, this too requires the full skill. More so, if anything, sir. It's easier by far to keep a bell going once it's swinging than to bring it round just the once and have it sound clean and stop. That takes a ringer's touch, sir, and no mistake. Poirot was silent a long moment, looking up at the great dark shape above them, and when he spoke again, it was as much to himself as to Simmons. Then whoever rang this bell on the night in question was no stranger to its ways. Not an intruder groping in the dark by luck alone, but someone who had rung it before, who knew its weight, its rhythm, its particular temper, as a man knows an old and difficult friend. There's precious few who could claim such knowledge, sir. Myself. Old Coates, in his younger days, though he's not touched a rope in 10 years and more, his hip being what it is. And Simmons stopped, and a strange, uncertain look crossed his thin face, as though he had arrived, without quite meaning to, at a thought he did not know what to do with. And? Poirot prompted, very gently. Cannon fellows, sir, God rest him. He took to it late, as I told the inspector's men, came to me himself, must be 9-10 years back now, and asked would I teach him the ringing, an old man wanting a new skill for his last years, or so I took it at the time. He was a quick study, sir, I'll say that for him, quicker than most I've taught. Took to it like he'd some particular reason for wanting the knowledge, though I never thought to ask what it might be. Old men take up strange hobbies, sir, and a ringer doesn't question a willing pupil. Poirot felt, in that moment, the particular quiet exhilaration that came to him always at the instant when a case, long resistant, began at last to yield its shape. Not yet the whole of it, but enough of the outline to see where the remaining darkness must be pressing. "Monsieur Simmons, I must ask you a question of some delicacy, and I ask you to consider it with great care before you answer. Canon Fellows learned to ring this bell, by your own account, with unusual skill and unusual purpose, some 9 or 10 years before his death. Did he, so far as you are aware, ever teach that same skill to another? Did he bring with him, upon any occasion, a companion, a relative, some younger person to whom he might have passed on what he had learned?" Simmons frowned in the effort of memory, and then, slowly, his face clearing as the recollection surfaced. "Now that you ask it plain, sir, yes. There was a young fellow used to come with him, now and again, toward the end. Nephew, I always understood him to be, though I couldn't swear to the exact relation. Quiet sort. Fellows would have him stand by and watch the ringing, and once or twice let him take the rope himself, under his own hand, teaching him the way of it, as he'd been taught himself, I suppose. I never thought more of it than an old man wanting company in his hobby, and glad of a young pair of arms besides, his own strength not being what it was by then. Do you recall this young man's name?" "That I don't, sir, and that's the truth. It's 10 years and more, and he was never introduced to me proper. I was but the teacher after all, and he but a visitor standing by. But I'd know his face again, I think, were I to see it. There was something in the set of it, the eyes, perhaps, that put me in mind, now I come to think on it, of—" Simmons stopped again, and this time the look that crossed his face was closer to alarm than uncertainty. "Of whom, monsieur? I beg you, do not stop now. Of young Mr. Coates, sir. The verger's own son, that went away to Australia some years back, or so it was always said in the town." Simmons's voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "Though I couldn't swear to it, sir, not after so long, and it may be I'm merely fancying a resemblance where none exists." Poirot did not press him further, for he had learned long ago that a memory pressed too hard would as often invent as recall, and what he required now was not certainty from Simmons, who could give none, but confirmation from records that could not lie, however imperfectly men remembered. He found old Coates the verger in the vestry an hour later, going about his ordinary duties with the slow, careful movements of a man for whom every task had long ago become a kind of prayer in itself, and it was there, watching the old man's weathered hands moving among the vestments with such quiet, habitual tenderness that Poirot understood he was about to cause pain to someone who had, in 30 years of faithful service, done nothing whatever to deserve it, save the misfortune of loving a son who had, perhaps, become something Coates himself could scarcely have imagined. "Monsieur Coates," he said, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he chose his words now with rather more gentleness than his profession generally allowed him. "I must ask you about your son." The old man's hands stilled upon the folded linen before him, and did not move again for a long moment. "He's in Australia, sir," Coates said at last, and there was something in his voice, a carefulness, a rehearsed quality, that told Poirot, before another word was spoken, that he had found, at last, the thread that would unravel the whole of it. "Has been these 8 years and more." "Has he?" said Poirot quietly. "I wonder, Monsieur Coates, whether you would object very much to telling me the truth of that matter, for I think you and I both know that it is not, entirely, the truth, and I think also, my friend, that the time for protecting him with silence has very nearly and very sadly come to its end." The gathering in the nave. Old Coates did not answer at once. He set down the linen he had been folding, with the particular care of a man performing one last ordinary act before surrendering to something extraordinary, and when at last he spoke, his voice had lost the rehearsed carefulness of a moment before, and held instead the flat, exhausted honesty of a man too tired to lie any longer. "He never went to Australia, sir. That was my own doing, that story. Told first to spare his mother's feelings, God rest her, and told so many years running that I believe half the town has forgotten it was ever anything but truth. My Michael's been in Dover this decade past, sir, working the boats, and coming to see me quiet-like, of an evening, when he thinks no one's watching. And why, monsieur, did a father find it necessary to hide so simple a thing as a son working honest work in Dover? Coates's old eyes, when he raised them, were wet. Because it was never so simple as that, sir, not from the start. Michael fell in with Canon Fellows when he was but a lad of 17, wanting work about the cathedral, and the old canon took a fancy to him, taught him his letters better, taught him the ringing, as you've heard, and filled his head besides, sir, with all manner of talk about old wrongs done to our family's name, though we're no relation to the Fellows at all. Only Michael took the old man's grievance to heart, as though it were his own blood's shame to write. Fellows never found what he was hunting for, sir, not in all his years of searching, but he passed the hunting on to my boy before he died, same as another man might pass on a disease. Poirot said nothing, and let the silence draw the rest from him, as he had learned, over so many years, that silence so often did better work than questioning. Michael came to me 3 weeks back, Coates went on, half out of his wits with excitement, saying he'd found it at last, found where the old relic had gone, all those years back, and proof besides of who'd taken it, proof that would clear the family name Fellows had spent his life fretting over. He wanted access to the old records, sir, the ones kept private in the chapter archive, and he asked would I get the tower key for him, Fellows's own key, that I'd kept hid all these years out of some foolishness I can't rightly explain, not liking to hand over what a dead man had trusted to me. He said he'd ring the bell once, at midnight, to test whether he still had the old skill in his arms, after so many years away from it. A foolish, prideful thing to do. I told him so myself, but he was ever a headstrong boy, sir, and he did it before I could talk him from it. And Canon Whitfield, Poirot said quietly. He had taken possession, had he not, of Canon Fellows's papers. Michael went to him, sir, the very week after the bell rang, went to ask, civil enough at the first, whether the canon might let him see what papers he held, seeing as they touched on family matters, or so Michael put it to him, but Whitfield would have none of it. Told him the papers were church property now, and no business of an outsider's, and, sir, from what Michael told me after, in a state I'd never before seen my boy in. Whitfield laughed at him. Laughed, sir, and said something cruel about ambitious young men chasing dead men's fancies, and turned him from the door like a beggar. The old man's voice broke at last. I don't believe my Michael went there that morning meaning murder, sir. I'll believe that till my own dying day, whatever a court may say of it. I believe he went only to ask once more, quiet, before the early service, when he thought to find the canon alone, and something was said between them that neither man could take back. It was, Poirot reflected afterward, one of the more melancholy confessions he had received in a long career, not short of melancholy confessions, and he left old Coates to Hargreaves' more official questioning, with a heaviness of spirit he did not trouble to disguise. They gathered that evening in the nave itself, at Poirot's particular request. Ainsworth, Miss Prentice, Simmons, old Coates seated apart with a constable near at hand, and Hargreave standing by the great west door with the patient, watchful stillness of a man who had, over the preceding hour, been given cause to trust the little Belgian's methods rather more than he had expected to at the outset of the affair. The cathedral, empty now of its ordinary business, held the particular hush of evening, the last light fading through the high windows into a deep and darkening blue, and Poirot, standing small and precise before them all, seemed for a moment almost to belong to the ancient stone around him, as though he too were some carved and watchful figure set there to keep account of human frailty. "I will not keep you long," he began, "for the hour is late, and the truth, when it is at last laid bare, requires no great ornament to make its meaning plain. This began, as you all now know, not 3 weeks past, with a bell that rang when no hand should have touched it, and I confess to you that I very nearly mistook its meaning at the outset, for I thought at first only to ask who had rung it, when the better question, The question that would have led me sooner to the truth was why a man who had learned the ringing in secret should choose that particular night to test his old, half-forgotten skill. It was not malice that rang that bell, mes amis. It was a young man's excitement, misguided, reckless, but not yet touched by violence, testing whether 10 years away from the rope had robbed him of what an old teacher had once given him. He turned his gaze, gently, toward old Coates, who sat with his head bowed and did not look up. That teacher was Canon Fellows, who spent the last years of his life chasing the shadow of a relic lost 30 years before his own birth, was quite forgotten by this cathedral, and who passed that chase, like an inheritance, to a boy who loved him and believed, as the young so often and so touchingly believe, that an old wrong might yet be righted by sufficient devotion. Michael Coates did not kill Canon Whitfield in cold calculation, and I do not believe, moreover, that he set out that morning intending harm of any kind. He went only to ask, one final time, for papers he believed were rightfully his to see. But Canon Whitfield, a man by every account I have gathered, more comfortable with sternness than with kindness, met that request with contempt, and contempt, mes amis, delivered to a young man already strained past his own endurance by years of secret hoping, can do in a single unguarded moment what calculation alone could never accomplish. Miss Prentice made a small, stifled sound, and Ainsworth reached, without seeming quite to notice that he did so, to steady her arm. The candlestick was close to hand, Poirot went on, more quietly now. The blow was struck, I believe, in a single moment of rage that its author regretted before the sound of it had finished echoing from these stones. And it was old Coates himself, a father protecting his son, as fathers have done since fathers first existed, who hid the weapon where it might yet be found by others, but not, he hoped, be traced too quickly to the hand that swung it, and who later, I think, composed that clumsy warning upon Miss Prentice's window, in a last, desperate hope of frightening our inquiries into silence before they reached the truth he had already, in his heart, half guessed. Coates did not deny it. He sat very still, an old man grown suddenly older still beneath the weight of what he had at last been made to say aloud. And it was Hargreave, moving forward now with the quiet, unhurried authority of a man about to perform a duty he took no pleasure in, who spoke the words that closed the matter formally, though not, Poirot suspected, watching the old verger's stricken face, the matter of the heart that lay beneath it. Afterward, when the nave had emptied, and the last of the evening light had failed entirely, leaving only the small warm glow of candles about the altar, Ainsworth walked with Poirot along the quiet cloister, neither man speaking for some minutes, until at last the Dean broke the silence. "A relic 30 years lost, Poirot, and a family's pride, and a young man's misplaced devotion, and at the end of it all, a good man dead, and a father's heart broken beyond mending. I confess, I find myself wondering what any of it was worth." "It is always so, mon ami," Poirot said, "with secrets kept too long in the dark. They do not remain small merely because they are hidden. They grow, in the silence, into something far larger and far more dangerous than the truth would ever have been, had it been spoken plainly at the first. I made my own small error in this matter, you will recall. I asked a young woman a question too narrowly, and was satisfied too easily with the answer she gave me, and it cost us, I think, a day we might otherwise have spared old Coates and his son. I tell you this not to excuse what has happened, but because I think it is worth remembering, even for a man such as myself, that certainty arrived at too quickly is very often no true certainty at all, but merely the shape of the question we were too tired or too satisfied to ask a second time. They walked on a little further, past the great dark bulk of the tower rising silent above them against the last deep blue of the evening sky, and Ainsworth, glancing up at it, said quietly, "It will never sound quite the same to me again, that bell, not after this." "Perhaps that is not entirely a misfortune," Poirot said. A bell that has taught a cathedral to listen more carefully to the silences between its own ringing has, I think, done rather more good in the end than harm, though I do not doubt, my friend, that it will be a long while yet before you hear it toll again without a certain quickening of the heart. Above them, in the deepening dark, the great bell hung silent once more. Silent now, Poirot thought, not with the watchful, expectant silence he had first sensed climbing that narrow stair, but with the ordinary, patient stillness of a thing waiting only for its proper hour. Its secrets, at last, laid as much to rest as such secrets are ever laid.